They say that money cannot buy happiness, but I discovered it could certainly buy a very expensive, gold-plated version of hell. My name is Elodie, and until last summer, I was just a girl from a provincial town who had managed to marry into the prestigious, albeit crumbling, de Montfort lineage. The turning point wasn't the wedding, however. It was a shimmering lottery ticket that yielded a fortune large enough to rebuild empires. I thought I was liberating my husband, Julian, from the suffocating weight of his family's expectations. Instead, I unknowingly funded a grand stage for my own public execution. To celebrate our newfound wealth, I organized what I envisioned as a dream retreat at the Villa de Sor, a secluded sanctuary on the French Riviera. I invited everyone, my humble parents, Julian's aristocratic but embittered mother, Beatrice, his father, Philippe, and his sister, Camille, with her brood of unruly children. I paid for everything, the private jets, the vintage Bordeaux, the silk-lined suites, hoping to bridge the chasm between our worlds. But Beatrice de Montfort did not see a gift. She saw a threat. From the moment the wheels of our car crunched the gravel of the villa's driveway in Nice, her venom began to seep into the Mediterranean air. She didn't complain about the cost, for that would be beneath her. Instead, she attacked the atmosphere. The humid sea breeze was an insult to her lungs. The brilliant azure sky was too piercing for her refined eyes. While my parents stood in silent awe of the oceanfront view, Beatrice spent her first hour lamenting the placement of her suite. Even the private infinity pool, a masterpiece of glass and stone, was deemed a drowning hazard and an unnecessary vanity. I watched Julian attempt to pacify her, his shoulders stooping under the familiar weight of her disapproval, while I felt a cold realization dawning on me. This wasn't a vacation. It was a siege. And in the shadows of the villa, I noticed a man I didn't recognize, a tall, silent figure in a charcoal suit, watching us through binoculars from the cliffside path. He wasn't staff. He was a predator, waiting for a scent of blood. The tension reached its zenith on the third day. During a private gala cruise aboard Le Coeur de l'Ocean, I had arranged for the yacht to take us around the Lérins Islands, envisioning a sunset filled with reconciliation. Instead, I found myself trapped in a web of silent accusations. Beatrice arrived on deck draped in diamonds, specifically her infamous Coeur de Glace earrings, pear-cut stones that had been in the de Montfort family for generations. I had warned her, perhaps too pointedly, that the sea was treacherous for such treasures and suggested she leave them in the villa's vault. She had responded with a look of such concentrated disdain that I felt the temperature on the deck drop 10 degrees. Camille, usually the loudest person in any room, was unnervingly quiet that afternoon, her eyes darting between her mother and the horizon. As the yacht swayed, Beatrice claimed a sudden bout of seasickness and retreated to the lower lounge, tossing her earrings carelessly into her clutch. An hour later, a blood-curdling scream fractured the evening. We found Beatrice in the center of the salon, her face a mask of histrionic despair. The earrings were gone. In an instant, the mask of the refined aristocrat fell away, revealing a feral creature. She didn't look for the stones. She looked for a culprit. Her finger, trembling with theatrical rage, pointed directly at my mother and then at me. She screamed that we, the proletariat invaders, had planned this since the day the lottery check cleared. She claimed I had warned her only to track the jewelry's location. I looked at Julian, expecting a roar of defense, but he stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the entrance of the cabin where the man in the charcoal suit, I now realized, was a private investigator named Lucien. Suddenly appeared. Lucien didn't look at the missing diamonds. He looked at me with a gaze that suggested he knew a secret about my lottery win that I hadn't even told my husband. The air grew thick with a different kind of humidity, the smell of a trap being sprung. Beatrice demanded the captain turn the ship back to the port of Cannes, promising that the gendarmerie would be waiting to strip search us all. The return to the Villa de Sor was not a journey. It was a funeral procession for my sanity. The gendarmerie were already there, their blue lights pulsing against the ancient, white stone of the villa. Like a rhythmic heartbeat of doom, Beatrice sat in the grand foyer, sipping herbal tea as if she hadn't just accused her daughter-in-law of a felony. I expected the officers to begin their search with the staff or the guest wings, but their focus was surgical. They went straight for my personal study. It was then I saw the first crack in the foundation of my marriage. Julian didn't stand by me. He stood by the window, his back turned, watching the sea. When I reached for his hand, he pulled away, whispering that we had to let the law take its course. His coldness was sharper than any blade. As the officers sifted through my documents, I noticed Lucian, the investigator, leaning against the doorframe. He wasn't looking at the police. He was looking at a specific floorboard near my desk. That night, while the villa slept in a suffocating silence, I crept into the study. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pried up the loose floorboard Lucian had been staring at, expecting to find the diamonds. Instead, I found a leather-bound ledger and a series of bank statements. They weren't mine. They belonged to Julian. My loving husband had been draining our lottery fund long before this trip, funneling massive sums into an offshore account in Luxembourg. But it wasn't for greed. The ledger revealed a darker truth. The de Montfort estate was not just crumbling. It was buried in debt to a man known only as Le Corbeau, the Raven. The lottery win hadn't been a gift to our future. It had been a temporary shield against a predator who was now coming to collect. I realized then that the missing earrings were a diversion, a staged crisis to justify a larger insurance claim, or perhaps to frame me and seize the remaining millions. I felt a presence behind me. It was Camille. She wasn't crying anymore. She held a heavy brass lamp in her hand, her eyes vacant and cold, and for the first time, I saw the predator in the sister-in-law I had tried to love. Camille didn't strike. Instead, she sat on the edge of the desk, the lamp dangling from her fingers. She confessed that she had taken the earrings, but not for herself. She was the one being blackmailed by Le Corbeau, an antagonist from their father, Philippe's past, who held secrets that could destroy the D.I. Montfort name forever. My lottery money was supposed to buy their silence, but Julian had gambled it away on high-stakes trades, trying to triple the fortune and failing miserably. This staged theft was Beatrice's desperate attempt to claim insurance and blame the outsider, me too, keep the family scandal private. But then came the true plot twist. Lucian, the silent investigator, walked into the room. He didn't arrest Camille. Instead, he took the ledger from my hands. He revealed he wasn't hired by Beatrice. He was the Raven's envoy. But with a twist, he was actually my half-brother I never knew existed. A secret my own father had kept for decades. He wasn't there to destroy me. He was there to dismantle the de Montforts from the inside. For what they had done to our family years ago, the betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. My husband had used my luck to pay for his family's sins, and my mother-in-law had orchestrated a crime to hide their bankruptcy. Lucian looked at me with eyes that mirrored my own and proposed a pact. We could expose the truth, let the de Montforts fall into the ruin they deserved, and disappear with what remained of the fortune. But there was a catch. To do so, I would have to become the very thing. Beatrice accused me of being a thief and a conspirator. As dawn began to break over the Mediterranean, painting the sky in bloody oranges and bruised purples, I realized that the woman who entered this villa a week ago was dead. In her place stood someone who understood that in the world of high society and ancient names, the only way to survive a den of vipers is to grow fangs of your own. I looked at the security camera in the corner, knowing it had captured everything, and I realized I needed to get to the footage before the gendarmerie returned. I navigated the corridors of Villa d'Azur like a ghost in my own home, the cold marble floors chilling the soles of my feet. My destination was the security room, a cramped, windowless chamber hidden behind the library's false wall. I knew the code. Julian had shared it in a rare moment of drunken vulnerability weeks ago. Inside, the wall of monitors cast a ghostly blue flicker across my face. I rewound the footage from the Cours d'Ocean Gala, my breath hitching as I watched Camille's trembling hands reach for the earrings. But as I continued to watch, the scene shifted to the villa's terrace from 3 nights ago. There, in the grainy infrared light, I saw my father, Philippe, meeting Lucien. They weren't strangers. They embraced with a familiarity that shattered my last remaining sense of reality. My father, the man I thought was a simple provincial teacher, was whispering into the ear of the Raven's envoy. The betrayal wasn't just coming from my husband's side of the family. The rot had started in my own bloodline. I felt the walls closing in. The lottery win hadn't been a stroke of luck. It had been a calculated injection of capital into a failing dynasty, orchestrated by players I hadn't even recognized. I realized then that Lucien's claim of being my half-brother might be another layer of the deception, a way to bind me to his cause while he dismantled the de Montforts. I began to delete the files, my fingers flying across the keyboard, erasing the evidence of Camille's theft and the secret meetings. If the gendarmerie found nothing, the power dynamic would shift. I would no longer be the suspect. I would be the victim of a false accusation by a senile matriarch. But as the progress bar reached 90%, the door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I could smell the familiar scent of expensive tobacco and sea salt, Julien. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching the screen as the last of the evidence vanished into digital nothingness. In that moment of shared silence, I realized he wasn't there to stop me. He was there because he was just as terrified of the Raven as I was. The next morning, breakfast was served on the terrace under a sun so bright it felt like an interrogation lamp. The gendarmerie had returned, their faces grim after a night of fruitless searching. Beatrice was in rare form, her voice a sharp staccato as she demanded an immediate arrest. She hadn't realized yet that the digital trail had been scrubbed. I sat opposite her, calmly spreading jam on a croissant, watching the subtle tremor in Julien's hands as he poured coffee. I decided it was time to play my first card. Without looking up, I mentioned a letter I had found in the library, a letter addressed to Philippe from a law firm in Paris regarding an old estate in Brittany. I saw the color drain from Beatrice's face, a stark white contrast to her meticulously applied rouge. The mention of Brittany was a shot in the dark, a fragment I had seen in Julien's secret ledger. But the reaction was explosive. She dropped her silver spoon, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. The psychological warfare shifted instantly. Philippe, who had been maintaining a stoic silence, suddenly looked at his wife with a mixture of pity and terror. I realized then that the de Montfort's secrets were not a monolith. They were a collection of individual lies that were starting to collide. I leaned in, my voice a whisper that carried only to the family table, suggesting that perhaps the thief wasn't looking for diamonds, but for the documents hidden behind the velvet lining of the jewelry box. This was a lie, but a necessary one. I watched as the seeds of suspicion I had planted began to sprout. Beatrice looked at Camille. Camille looked at the floor. And Julien looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. I wasn't the naive girl from the provinces anymore. I was the one holding the matches in a house made of dry parchment. The gendarmerie captain approached, sensing the shift in atmosphere. But I simply smiled and offered him a seat, playing the role of the gracious hostess while I felt the heavy weight of the Coeur de Glace earrings, which I had retrieved from Camille's room earlier, burning a hole in my pocket. The Mediterranean night was a thick, velvety curtain that seemed to swallow the very light of the stars. I waited by the ancient stone sundial in the lower orchard, the scent of overripe lemons and damp earth clinging to my silk robe. I knew he would come. The man I had called father my entire life, Mark, emerged from the shadows not as the humble schoolteacher I remembered, but with the measured, predatory grace of a man who had spent decades orchestrated an elaborate revenge. He didn't offer a fatherly embrace. Instead, he stood several paces away, his silhouette blending into the cypress trees. He confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The lottery win was no accident of mathematics. It was a sophisticated financial maneuver, a Trojan horse designed to inject untraceable funds into the de Montforts, failing accounts, giving Ussor him legal access to their most guarded assets. I was the bridge, the unsuspecting vessel through which he funneled his long-awaited retribution. But the revelation that cut the deepest was the identity of La Corbeau. It wasn't Mark, the Raven was a title passed down through our bloodline, a legacy of a family the de Montforts had ruined and erased from the records of Brittany a century ago. Lucien, the man who claimed to be my half-brother, was actually Mark's protege, a weapon forged in the same fire of resentment. My father explained that the de Montforts hadn't just lost their fortune, they had stolen ours, building their prestige on the bones of our ancestors' estates. The missing diamonds were a mere catalyst, a way to test my resolve and force the family into a corner. I stood there, feeling the weight of the stolen earrings in my pocket, realizing that I was the final piece of a puzzle started long before I was born. My father wasn't asking for my forgiveness. He was asking for my complicity. He wanted me to use my position as the wronged victim to finalize the legal seizure of the Villa d'Azur, leaving the de Montforts not just disgraced, but homeless and destitute. The following morning, the atmosphere in the villa was brittle, like ancient parchment ready to ignite. I returned the cord de glace earrings to the jewelry box in Beatrice's room, but not before coating the inner velvet with a subtle, colorless chemical-attracting compound Lucien had provided. I then joined the family for tea in the solarium, watching the play of shadows on the floor. Beatrice, emboldened by a night of plotting, announced that she had found evidence of my mother's involvement in Festata, planted receipt for a high-end fence in Marseille. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Instead, I leaned back and looked directly at Julien. I asked him, in a voice devoid of emotion, about the woman he had been meeting in Cannes during our business trips. The silence that followed was absolute. I revealed that I had not only seen his bank transfers, but had also discovered the mistress he was using our lottery money to support. The betrayal was a double-edged sword. Julien's face transformed from arrogant indifference to sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at his mother, then at me, realizing that the quiet girl had been collecting ammunition while they were busy playing aristocrats. I then turned my gaze to Philippe, the patriarch, and whispered the name of the estate in Brittany that Mark had mentioned. The effect was instantaneous. Philippe suffered a minor collapse, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the ghost of his family's original sin finally caught up with him. I stood up, the power in the room shifting toward me like a physical tide. I informed them that the gendarmerie captain was a close associate of a man they should very much fear, and that's the only way to avoid prison for insurance, fraud, and embezzlement was to sign over the villa to a private trust I controlled. I watched as the de Montfort lineage, centuries of pride and cruelty, crumbled before me in a single afternoon. I felt no triumph, only a cold, hollow satisfaction. I had become the architect of their ruin, a mirror image of the monsters who had tried to destroy me. The silence that followed the downfall of the de Montforts was not peaceful. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a graveyard, as Beatrice and Philippe were led away by the gendarmerie for questioning their regal composure finally shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I found myself alone in the grand ballroom of the Villa de Shore. The moonlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the marble floor into a frozen lake. It was then that Lucien appeared, stepping out from behind a heavy velvet curtain. But his expression had changed. The supportive brother I thought I had found was gone, replaced by a man whose eyes held the cold glitter of a professional scavenger. He didn't come to congratulate me on our victory. He came to collect the inheritance he believed he had earned. He revealed that the lottery funds had never been meant for me or for the de Montfort's debts. They were a deposit for a much larger transaction involving the illegal sale of the very estate in Brittany I had used as a weapon. My heart went cold as I realized the extent of the web. Lucien wasn't just my father's protege. He was the one who had manipulated my father into this obsession with revenge. The Raven was a ghost story they had used to lure me into their game. Lucien explained that the lottery was a front for money laundering, and by signing the trust documents earlier that afternoon, I hadn't just taken control of the villa, had unwittingly signed my name to a series of criminal enterprises. He laughed a dry, rattling sound as he told me that my husband Julian had known about this from the start. Julian hadn't just gambled the money away. He'd been paid to look the other way while Lucien and Mark dismantled his family. I was the only one who had truly believed in the luck of the draw. I stood there, surrounded by the shadows of a history I never asked for, realizing that the people I loved were merely different versions of the same predator. But Lucien had made one mistake. He assumed I was still the same girl who had entered the villa with a suitcase full of dreams. In the final hours before dawn, I played my last move not as a victim, but as a master of the board. I had known that the lottery was too perfect. So I had spent the previous nights at the villa's security terminal, not just deleting footage, but redirecting the digital flow of the funds Lucien coveted. While he was busy gloating, I had funneled the remaining millions into a series of untraceable charity foundations in my mother's name, leaving only a trail of debt for Lucien and my father to find. When I revealed this to him, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped toward me, but I didn't flinch. I informed him that I had already sent a detailed dossier of the entire operation, the money laundering, the insurance fraud, and the identity of the Raven to a contact in the international press. If anything happened to me, or if they tried to follow me, the world would know every dirty secret the de Montfort and the Raven lineages ever held. I watched him realize that he had lost. The predator had been oath-hunted by its prey. Without a word, Lucien retreated into the shadows, knowing that the gendarmerie would soon be back with questions he couldn't answer. I walked out of the Villa d'Azur as the sun began to rise over the Mediterranean, casting a golden light that finally felt warm rather than clinical. My husband was a stranger, my father a ghost of a man I never truly knew. In the de Montforts where a cautionary tale whispered, in the Café Said Nice, I took nothing with me but the clothes I wore and the small, digital key to the foundations I had created. I had lost the family I thought I had, but I had gained something far more valuable, the truth of who I was. As I boarded a train heading north, away from the salt air and the gilded traps of the Riviera, I looked at my reflection in the window. The girl from the provinces was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived the vipers and walked away with the only thing that couldn't be stolen, her freedom.